Well, there's good news coming out of Afghanistan. A ceasefire was declared by the U.S.-backed government in Kabul and the Taliban. Uh, they apparently held it out. They went 3 days without fighting each other. There were other people fighting, of course, but it looks like the two sides here were able to make an agreement and stick to it. Now, it's only a 3-day thing, but considering how much progress has been made over the last year or so in Afghanistan, I am still trying to be optimistic. There was, of course, a peace deal thing trying to be negotiated for a long time there. Things had seemed to have stalled since that had been wrapped up, and Khalilzad, the president's special negotiator, had supposedly finished his deal with the Taliban. The long-time holdup here has always been that the Taliban doesn't recognize the Kabul government, and of course, because of that, the Kabul government isn't very happy with any deal that doesn't include them, and so it's just, it's been kind of a stalemate forever. But to be fair, the Taliban are being pretty realistic when they say, well, why would we negotiate with the Kabul government? Because the U.S. are the ones with power. They know that if the U.S. wasn't there, that other government would fall overnight, and so there's really no point in talking to them because they're powerless. And I kind of have some respect for that from the Taliban, even though I don't, obviously I don't like the Taliban personally. They're a bunch of rather backwards people. But they've got a certain honesty to them that has been lost in the modern era of diplomatic niceties between nations. Now, apparently, as a part of the peace process, not the police process, the Kabul government was supposed to release about 5,000 Afghan troops who had been held prisoner, and that apparently is about done. They've released something like 4,900. And, as kind of an act of good faith, hopefully this means that these men won't just turn right back around and start fighting again. It would be nice that, now that all these guys are let out, if people could, sit down and definitely not settle their differences, but at least try and get to a point to where the U.S. can kind of save some face and leave. Because, let's be honest, as soon as the U.S. goes, the Taliban's going to take over again. Because they're the single, most powerful group. The thing is, in Afghanistan, there's a bunch of different groups. They all squabble around together, and the Taliban just happens to be the biggest. It's not that the Taliban has, universal support or anything like that. They just have a plurality of support because, their ethnic group, the Pashtuns, make up a plurality of the population. Although I guess I have more of a reason now to be skeptical that the U.S. will ever leave Afghanistan, than I was, a year or two ago, because now you've got all these tensions ramped up with China and the U.S. And really the only thing that I think was keeping the U.S. in Afghanistan was China. Because if you look at a map, what interest could the U.S. possibly have in Afghanistan? There's really nothing there. There's no civilization to try and rebuild or anything like that. There's no chance that Afghanistan will ever be West Germany and will be some great, economic ally. It's just people, I think people understand that reality. But what is there is China, and as long as the U.S. is in Afghanistan, well, then that puts a roadblock, between China, and two of its allies, that being Pakistan and Iran. If China wants to build this, one belt, one road initiative, which the U.S. is so up in arms about and thinks it's terrible. Oh my God, China might build a road all the way to Portugal, and it would snake through all these different countries. Well, obviously it has to go through Afghanistan. Afghanistan sits, square between Iran and Pakistan. And now that, we've got China hysteria cranked up to 11 or so, I don't think that the U.S. will be doing anything that the folks in Washington could ever construe as in some way helping China. After all, those of us who, are making fun of the TikTok ban and how absurd it is that all of a sudden the U.S. government is concerned about the privacy of its citizens and saying, "Oh my gosh, China's spying on people. That's so, that's so beyond the pale." Even though, our tech companies and our government and the NSA are doing the exact same thing. Those of us who point out that irony are just called, simps for China. So I'd imagine anyone who has the gall at this point to say that, the U.S. probably shouldn't be in Afghanistan at this point is, again, going to be labeled a simp for China. And I guess it's natural. Anti-war people are always labeled as, lovers of whatever the chosen enemy of that time is. I mean, all of the folks who opposed World War II were called Nazi sympathizers or Nazis themselves. I mean, heck, back then it was just an accusation, but these days anyone who opposed World War II is outright considered to be a Nazi. So it's unfortunate, but I do think that Afghanistan is a pawn in the great game that is being played right now between the U.S. and China. And so not really anything's going to change. I think that the U.S. is going to be very content leaving troops in Afghanistan. I think that if I were a general, it would be very easy to convince Trump to stay in Afghanistan, even though Trump ran on getting the troops out of Afghanistan. I mean, look at how quickly he folded after he got into office. Getting out of Afghanistan was supposed to be, like one of his #1 promises. And as soon as he gets in like February of 2017, he gives this big speech talking about how, like, oh, well, we can't actually leave Afghanistan yet. We've still got a little bit to do. We can't just go abandoning our allies, all of this nonsense that we've heard a million times. We don't want it to become a, safe haven, blah, blah, blah. But there was a glimmer of hope, even though Trump immediately came out and started, going over the regular Bush-Obama talking points about Afghanistan. He appointed Zalmay Khalilzad to try and negotiate a withdrawal, try and negotiate with the Taliban. It was very promising. I followed those talks very closely. As anyone who's been subscribed to this channel long-term will know, there's, plenty of videos talking about Afghanistan and Khalilzad and their negotiations. But given this flare-up with China, I think that might be all for naught. The U.S. has no interest, at this point in giving up a military position so close to China. Even though, if you ask me, it's much more of a liability than an asset. That's not how the U.S. military thinks. The U.S. military thinks that it can beat anyone, even a nuclear power, even though that's absurd. The very idea of going to war with China, which I've been over before, is ridiculous. Could never happen, would destroy this country, yet people still like to fantasize about going to war with China or even Russia. Even going to war with Russia would be, absurd. But really, I mean, they think of this like it's a big game. It's not a game. You don't try and set up troops, all around a country as if you can invade them. Not that, really the U.S. has enough troops in Afghanistan to invade China anyway, which is why I say it's a liability, not not an asset to keep troops there. But again, I think that that there's still, after all the losing that America has done since the end of the Cold War, which, don't make no mistake, in 1991 that was the last victory America ever had, and it was against puny little Saddam Hussein. Ever since then, it's been lose, 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 lose. But after all that, our military planners still seem to think that we can impose our will on the entirety of the planet. And of course, even though they never admit it, even though people in Washington, the think tank types, even I think during the Cold War, I think there was a little more respect for nuclear weapons because there was a memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But now, because all those people are dead who remember the first time nukes were detonated, I don't think there's a proper respect for nuclear weaponry. So I think people do maybe seriously talk about going to war with a country like China. But there is still, at a very fundamental level, this understanding that that won't happen and that can't happen. And so therefore, all of these actions taken against a country like China is still posturing to a certain extent. It's way too close to a real action. But I still hold out hope that it is just posturing, because the true presence in Afghanistan, as I said, is not an invasion force. It's nothing that it's nothing that could combat China if for some reason the U.S. declared war on China tomorrow. The troops in Afghanistan would not stand a chance against all the resources that China and Pakistan has. And so, just like the troops in West Berlin, it's sort of a speed bump. It's a thorn in their side. I believe that's what Khrushchev called West Berlin, and that's kind of what the U.S. is trying to make Afghanistan for China. even if, it is sort of a Frankenstein monster, caricature of West Berlin. West Berlin was a thriving Western city, whereas Afghanistan is a total basket case. It's not prosperous and it doesn't set a good example. It's not really good for propaganda, but it does still represent a U.S. presence in China's neighborhood. So that's about all I have to say on this topic. I wish the Afghans well. I hope that the ceasefire can hold, and I hope more than anything that the U.S. might leave one day, but just given everything that's happened recently, I don't see that happening.